Welcome, weary traveler, to a journey through the distant past. As you settle in for a night's rest, let us transport you to a time long ago, an age of kings and castles, chivalry and cruelty. This is the medieval era, a world far removed from our own, yet one that has profoundly shaped the course of history. Before we begin our tale, I invite you to pause and share in the comments where you are listening from and what time of day it is for you. It's a simple pleasure that connects us across the miles and hours. If you enjoy these quiet excursions into the annals of history, be sure to subscribe so you never miss a bedtime story. Now, make yourself comfortable, dear listener. Dim the lights, fluff your pillow, and let your cares drift away as we embark on a journey to a distant time and place. Breathe deeply and let the worries of the modern world fade into the mists of history. Tonight, our story takes us to medieval Europe, a land of breathtaking beauty and brutal cruelty. It was a time of soaring cathedrals and squalid hovels, of courtly love and merciless punishments. Justice was swift and often brutal, with little regard for the rights of the accused. The concept of innocent until proven guilty was still centuries away, and the methods used to extract confessions were grim indeed. But before we delve into the darker chapters of medieval history, let us first set the scene. Imagine a world illuminated only by fire, where the flickering glow of torches and candles casts long shadows on stone walls. A world where the clang of swords and the thunder of hoofbeats are everyday sounds, where life is cheap and death is always close at hand. In this world, the social order was rigidly defined, with the nobility at the top and the peasantry at the bottom. The church wielded immense power, both spiritual and temporal, and to defy its edicts was to risk not only earthly punishment, but eternal damnation. In a world of stark absolutes, where right and wrong were defined with unwavering clarity, the consequences of sin were often met with brutal retribution. Against this backdrop, the mechanisms of justice took on a particularly harsh and unforgiving nature. Prisons as we know them today were a distant memory. Instead, the accused were confined to dank dungeons, often shackled, until their fate was determined. Trials, when they did occur, were mere formalities, with the outcome predetermined by the whims of the powerful. And the punishments, were as varied as they were cruel. From the mere humiliation to the utterly horrific, they ranged from the mundane to the macabre. In the coming hours, we will delve into some of the most notorious methods of medieval discipline. From the stocks and pillory to the rack and the stake, these dark chapters of history will be explored together. But fear not, gentle listener, for this is a journey of the mind, not the body. We will traverse these somber epochs of the past, safe in the knowledge that they are long gone. So let your mind drift back through the centuries to a world vastly different from our own. A harsher world, to be sure, but one that nonetheless shaped the contours of the present day. As we embark on our first tale, imagine a bustling market square in a medieval town. The sun casts a golden glow over the weathered stones of the surrounding buildings, while hawkers call out their wares, their voices mingling with the cries of goats and the clucking of chickens. And there, in the heart of the square, stands a grim wooden structure, the pillory. A man is locked within its confines, his head and hands protruding through the rough, hunkered boards. His face is a canvas of humiliation and anger, as a jeering crowd hurls rotten vegetables and dung at him. This is his punishment for a petty theft, a few hours of public humiliation and degradation. The pillory and its cousin, the stocks, were common sights in medieval towns and villages, serving as a stark reminder of the harsh realities of justice in that era. They were employed to punish a diverse range of offences, from petty theft and public drunkenness to more severe crimes like blasphemy and sedition. The objective was not only to inflict physical discomfort, but also to expose the offender to the scorn and ridicule of their neighbours. Imagine the unfortunate thief in our market square, his pride and dignity stripped away as he endures the taunts and insults of the crowd. The stench of the refuse thrown at him mingles with the sweat and grime of his unwashed body, while the relentless summer sun beats down mercilessly on his unprotected face and neck. Although a few hours in the pillory might be uncomfortable, it was far from the most severe fate that awaited a criminal in medieval times. In fact, public humiliation was often considered a lenient punishment reserved for minor offences and first-time offenders. However, for those who committed more serious crimes or repeated offenses, a harsher form of public shaming awaited them: branding. In this brutal practice, a red-hot iron was used to burn a permanent mark into the flesh of the condemned, typically on the face, hand, or chest. This visible mark served as a testament to their crimes, a lasting reminder that would accompany them for the rest of their lives. Consider the story of a young woman named Agnes, convicted of adultery in 14th century England. As punishment for her transgression, she was sentenced to be branded on the cheek with the letter A. The iron was heated until it glowed a fiery cherry red, then pressed firmly against her skin, sizzling and smoking as it seared the mark into her flesh. The pain must have been excruciating, but it was nothing compared to the shame and ostracism that Agnes would endure for the rest of her days. In a close-knit medieval community, such a visible mark of dishonor was akin to a death sentence, condemning her to a life of poverty and isolation. As the screams of the branded adulteress echo in your mind, let us venture deeper into the heart of medieval justice, leaving the market square behind. Our next destination is a place of darkness and dread, where the cries of the condemned blend with the creak, the sound of rusty hinges, and the drip of water on stone. We are entering the dungeon, a common feature of medieval castles and keeps. These subterranean chambers served as more than just prisons. They were places of torment where unfortunate souls who had displeased their betters were subjected to unimaginable agonies in the name of justice, or more often, vengeance. Imagine a narrow, winding staircase descending deep beneath the earth. The air grows colder and damper with each step until you finally emerge into a cavernous space, illuminated only by the flickering flame of a single torch. The walls are damp and slimy with mold, and the floor is strewn with rotting straw and the bones of long-dead prisoners. And there, in the flickering half-light, you see them, the instruments of torture, arranged like a hellish orchestra poised to play a symphony of pain. Racks and wheels, iron maidens and thumbscrews are among the devices designed to inflict maximum suffering on the fragile human form. One of the most feared of these devices was the rack, a wooden frame equipped with rollers and ratchets that could stretch a person's body to the breaking point. The victim's wrists and ankles would be fastened to the rollers, and the torturer would slowly and inexorably turn the handles, pulling the limbs in opposite directions. Imagine the agony of feeling your joints pop and your muscles scream as your body is stretched beyond its limits. Picture the sickening sound of tendons snapping and bones cracking under the relentless pressure, and imagine the chilling realization that your tormentors can keep going, ratcheting up the tension until your body is torn apart. Such was the fate of countless unfortunate souls in the dungeons of medieval Europe. One such victim was a man named Thomas, arrested on suspicion of treason against his king. Thomas, a minor nobleman, was accused of plotting to overthrow the monarch. He vehemently denied the charges, but his protests fell on deaf ears. He was dragged to the castle dungeon, stripped of his finery, and roughly thrown onto the rack. As the torturers turned the handles, his limbs began to stretch, and he screamed out his innocence, begging for mercy. But there was no mercy in that dark and terrible place. The torturer kept turning, and Thomas's screams turned to shrieks of agony as his shoulders popped out of their sockets and his joints began to separate. In the end, he confessed to anything and everything his tormentors wanted to hear, desperate to end the unimaginable pain. His fate was sealed by his confession, extracted under the most brutal of circumstances. He was dragged from the rack, a broken and bloody ruin, and taken to the executioner's block, where his head was struck off with a single blow. His body was then quartered and displayed on the city walls as a warning to others who might dare to defy the king. The rack was a horrific instrument of torture, but it was far from the only one used by medieval torturers. Another particularly gruesome device was the strappado, a kind of reverse hanging that put an excruciating strain on the victim's arms and shoulders. In this torture, the victim's hands were tied behind their back and hoisted into the air by a rope attached to their wrists. The sudden jerk as they were lifted off the ground dislocated their shoulders, causing intense pain and making it nearly impossible to breathe. But the strappado was more than just a way to inflict pain. It was also used as a method of interrogation. As the victim dangled in agony, their tormentors bombarded them with questions, demanding confessions or information. The combination of pain and suffocation often proved too much to bear, and many a prisoner broke under the strain, babbling out whatever their interrogators wanted to hear. One particularly chilling account of the strappado comes from the memoirs of a 14th-century Italian soldier named Giovanni. Captured by his enemies and accused of spying, Giovanni endured repeated rounds of the strappado, each more excruciating than the last. In his own words, he describes the sensation of being hoisted into the air, his arms wrenched behind him at an impossible angle. He vividly describes the searing pain in his shoulders, the tearing of his muscles, and the grinding of his bones against each other. Panic set in as he struggled to breathe, his chest compressed by the weight of his own body. Despite his efforts to endure, the pain became unbearable. With a choking sob, Giovanni betrayed his comrades, revealing the location of his army's camp and the plans of his commanding officers. For his treachery, he was spared the most severe punishments reserved for captured spies. However, the memory of his ordeal in the strappado haunted him for the rest of his days, serving as a stark reminder of the depths of human cruelty and the fragility of the human will. As the night deepens and your eyelids begin to droop, let us shift our focus from the grim spectre of torture to the final irrevocable punishment: death. In the medieval world, executions were a common occurrence, meted out for a wide range of crimes, including theft, heresy, treason, and murder. Among the most prevalent and straightforward methods of execution was beheading. Reserved primarily for nobles and individuals of high rank, beheading was considered a relatively swift and merciful means of death, especially when compared to some of the more gruesome alternatives. However, even beheading could be botched, as demonstrated by the tragic tale of Mary, Queen of Scots. Condemned to death for conspiring against her cousin, Queen Elizabeth I of England, Mary's execution remains a poignant reminder of the consequences of betrayal and the arbitrary nature of justice in the medieval era. Mary faced her fate with regal composure, even making a joke as she lay her head on the block. "I've never had such grooms before to make me unprepared," she quipped, referring to the men who had helped her remove her outer garments. However, Mary's composure was shattered when the executioner's first blow missed her neck entirely, striking the back of her head instead. Stunned and bleeding, Mary remained conscious as the executioner readied himself for a second blow. This time, the axe found its mark, but only partially, becoming lodged in the Queen's neck. It took a third blow to finally sever Mary's head from her body, ending her life in a gruesome and ignominious manner. For those of lower rank, hanging was the customary method of execution. Crowds would gather to witness the condemned being led to the gallows, their hands bound and their necks encircled by rough hemp rope. The executioner would place the noose around their neck, positioning the knot just so, and then, with a sharp tug, send them plummeting through the trapdoor to their death. In theory, a properly carried-out hanging was supposed to result in a swift death by broken neck. However, all too often, things did not go according to plan. Ropes could break, knots could slip, and instead of a swift end, the condemned would be left to strangle slowly, their bodies jerking and twitching in a grotesque dance of death. There were also the truly horrific methods of execution, reserved for the worst of the worst, including heretics, traitors, and the depraved. One such punishment was pressing, a slow and agonizing way to die that involved placing heavy stones on the victim's chest until they suffocated or their ribs collapsed. This was the fate of Margaret Clitheroe, a Catholic woman living in Elizabeth, England, when practicing Catholicism was forbidden. Margaret was arrested for harboring Catholic priests in her home, a crime that carried the death penalty. Margaret, refusing to plead guilty or not guilty to the charges, knowing it would implicate her children and servants, chose silence. Even as the judge ordered her to be pressed to death, the execution method was particularly cruel. Stripped naked and laid on the ground, a sharp stone was placed beneath her back. A door was then placed on top, and heavy stones were piled on it one by one until the weight crushed her life. Despite the stones grinding into her flesh and her bones cracking, Margaret remained silent. Her last words, as the weight bore down, were a prayer: "Jesus, have mercy on me." Margaret's story is tragic, yet it also serves as a testament to the power of faith and the human spirit's endurance in unimaginable suffering. As we delve into the dark annals of medieval punishment, we'll encounter many more tales of bravery and resilience in the face of cruelty and despair. But for now, dear listener, let's take a moment to rest and reflect. The hour is late, and the darkness presses in, heavy with centuries of history. As you drift off to sleep, let your mind wander back to the grim dungeons and blood-soaked scaffolds of the medieval world, secure in the knowledge that those days are long gone. The sun will rise on a brighter, more just tomorrow. When you wake, remember the tales we've shared and the lessons they still hold. Though the world has changed since the days of Rex and Iron Maidens, the human capacity for cruelty and courage remains constant. It's up to us in our own time to choose between brutality and fear or compassion and hope. But for now, dear listener, rest. Let the gentle embrace of slumber envelop you, and dream of a world where justice is tempered with mercy, and where the light of reason shines brightly against the darkness of ignorance and fear. Good night, and may you have pleasant dreams. Now let us delve into some of the most notorious executions in medieval history. These executions aim to prolong the victim's agony as long as possible before finally granting them the mercy of death. Perhaps the most iconic of these is the burning at the stake. The image of a condemned heretic or witch, tied to a wooden post, consumed by hungry flames, has been etched into our collective imagination through countless depictions in art, literature, and film. However, the grim reality was even more horrific than anything portrayed on celluloid. The convicted prisoner would be led out to the town square, where a pyre had been erected. Bundles of dry firewood were stacked high, and a sturdy stake was driven into the center. The victim's hands were bound behind them, and they were securely tied to the post, leaving no chance of escape. Imagine the scene: a jeering crowd gathered to witness the spectacle, their faces flickering red and orange in the firelight. The wood was set ablaze, and the kindling quickly caught, sending tendrils of black smoke curling into the evening sky. The fire licked higher, crackling and spitting, until it fully enveloped the helpless figure at its heart. Depending on the direction of the wind and the moisture in the wood, death could be mercifully quick, resulting in smoke inhalation that rendered the victim unconscious before the flames truly began their terrible work. However, more often, it was an agonizingly protracted affair. The victim was slowly roasted, their flesh blackening and peeling away to expose the raw muscle beneath. Eyeballs burst in the heat, fluids boiling and evaporating until finally, mercifully, the heart ceased its frantic beating. One cannot help but shudder at the sheer horror and pain endured by individuals like Geneviève, the young French warrior woman burned for heresy in 1431, or the 20 Anabaptists executed at the stake in Salzburg in 1528. Even the most stoic prisoner could not resist the screams as the hungry flames consumed them. However, death by burning was not the most prolonged or inventive form of execution devised by the cruel minds of the Middle Ages. That dubious honor may well belong to the breaking wheel. A thick wagon wheel was repurposed into an instrument of unimaginable brutality. The condemned would be spread eagled on the ground, limbs extended, and the heavy wooden wheel placed on top of them. The executioner would then methodically smash the victim's arms, legs, shoulders, and hips with a massive iron hammer, shattering the bones into splinters. This was no swift clinical breaking. Each shattered joint was carefully avoided to ensure the prisoner remained conscious throughout their ordeal. The aim was to utterly pulverize the limbs while keeping the vital organs intact, prolonging the agony for as long as possible. Once every bone had been systematically crushed to gravel, the mangled body would be woven through the spokes of the wheel and hoisted up on a tall pole, where it would remain on public display. Sometimes the executioner would deliver a fatal coup de grace to the chest, the so-called blow of mercy. However, more often, the broken thing that had once been human would be left to the mercy of the elements and the carrying birds. By some accounts, it could take days for them to succumb to blood loss, shock, and dehydration under the burning sun. Imagine the sight of ragged crows perching on that shattered rib cage, picking at the jellied eyes and lulling tongue. One of the most detailed accounts of a medieval wheel execution comes from 1589. A notorious gang leader named Chrisman Ganipatenga was captured after years of banditry. In the town square of Bedburg, Germany, a man was brutally executed. His ghastly remains were displayed on a pole along a major road as a grim warning to other would-be highwaymen. Public executions were a form of dark theatre in medieval times, serving as a reminder of the consequences of defying those in power. However, not every felon received the twisted mercy of a public send-off. Some faced death far from the eyes of the crowd, but no less gruesomely. Deep within the castle dungeon, a cauldron bubbled over a roaring fire, emitting foul-smelling steam from its churning depths. A stripped prisoner, hands bound, was led to the edge by grim-faced torturers. Perhaps he shivered in the dank chill or whimpered a last desperate plea for clemency, but it would avail him nothing. With rough hands, he was grasped and lifted over the lip of the terrible vat. Its contents were not water, but molten lead, boiling oil, or even burning pitch. He had only a moment to draw a final breath before being plunged down into the scalding soup and held under, thrashing and writhing. The searing agony was unimaginable as the boiling liquid closed over him, forcing its way into his eyes, nostrils, mouths, sizzling through his hair and skin. Blisters erupted instantly, and flesh sloughed off in pale strips to float on the surface. Trapped screams bubbled up in the royal, unheard by anyone except the hardened executioners. Death was not instantaneous even now. It took long minutes before the jerking and twitching ceased, before the prisoner's nerves were seared away, and his brain finally boiled in its skull. Only when the corpse was utterly still did the torturers draw it out with long metal hooks, leaving it unrecognizable, steam rising from the riend ruin. While not as common as burning or breaking, boiling alive was a fate reserved for criminals, counterfeits, and coin forgers in much of Europe. King Henry VIII introduced the practice to England in 1531, declaring it the penalty for murder by poison after a recent spate of suspicious aristocratic deaths. It's hard to imagine the extreme cruelty and sadism that medieval minds used to devise such punishments. But perhaps no execution method truly captured the dark ingenuity and ruthless brutality of that era, like hanging, drawing, and quartering. To us, it sounds almost absurd in its elaborate excess. An execution so intricate and convoluted that it defies belief. Yet this gruesome ritual was a legal requirement in England from the 13th century until 1867. The condemned man would first be tied to a hurdle or wooden frame and dragged by horse to the execution site, usually a major crossroads or public square for maximum visibility. He would then be hanged by the neck, but cut down and revived before the fatal strangulation could occur. This would start an ordeal of such grotesque and unthinkable savagery that it's hard to imagine the minds that conceived it. The half-strangled traitor would be stripped naked and displayed before the bloodthirsty crowd. The executioner would then take a sharp blade and slit open his belly, pulling out yards of slippery intestine and steaming viscera. Contemporary accounts differ on whether the entrails were then burned before the victim's fading eyes or simply tossed into a waiting bucket. Some even claim the executioner was expected to take a bite of the prisoner's quivering heart, still hot from his breast. While this may be just folklore, the reality is hardly less shocking. Even now, with guts unspooled in glistening ropes, the traitor still clung to the ragged edge of life. The final step was to hack the body into 4 pieces, literally to quarter it. Legs and arms would be severed with an axe or sword. Then, the dripping remains would be lifted high for all to see. The head and quarters would be mounted above the city gates or sent to the 4 corners of the kingdom as a grim reminder of the king's power and reach. Picked clean by crows and withered by the elements, these bodies might remain on display for months or even years afterward. Can you imagine a death more cruel, more viscerally and intimately agonizing? Among the most famous to suffer this fate was William Wallace, the Scottish knight, and leader of a rebellion against English rule, immortalized in the film Braveheart. Captured and convicted of treason in 1305, Wallace was stripped naked and dragged through London's streets at the heels of a horse. He was then hanged, drawn and quartered, with his head dipped in tar and displayed on London Bridge, while his limbs were sent to the 4 corners of the country as a warning against insurrection. While the depiction of his execution in Braveheart was mercifully brief, the real Wallace's ordeal likely spanned most of a day, every moment filled with unimaginable pain. It's astonishing that he was able to endure such prolonged and inventive torment. However, as we've seen, Wallace's gruesome fate was not unique. Throughout the medieval period, countless individuals suffered similar agonies. Whether in town squares at the hands of kings or in solitary dungeons under cruel lords, the vicious ingenuity employed in these cruel and unusual punishments is chilling to contemplate. Perhaps it speaks to some dark recesses of the human imagination, a morbid fascination with suffering and death that found its ultimate expression in these theatrically ghastly displays of power and brutality. How else to explain such a prodigious investment of effort and creativity in devising newer and more agonizing ways to bid farewell to life? Yet, from our vantage point across the centuries, there is something almost comically absurd about the medieval approach to execution. As if in their zeal to inflict the ultimate penalty, they lost sight of the fundamental fact of mortality that all lives, whether taken swiftly or through sadistic means, ultimately end the same. The headsman's axe and the torturer's pincers alike deliver their victims to the same dark door. No degree of agony can alter that fundamental truth. In a sense, those who met their end swiftly and cleanly under the sword or at the end of a rope were fortunate. Their suffering was brief, and their ultimate fate was no different from those who perished on the wheel or in the flames. Thus we conclude our grim account of medieval cruelty. These barbaric practices may seem distant to us now, relics of a darker age when life was cheaper and power was expressed through spectacle and savagery. However, it is imperative that we remember that the human capacity for cruelty and violence is far from extinct. The specific techniques may have evolved, but the underlying impulses that drove the medieval torturer are still present in war zones, interrogation rooms, and dark places where the strong prey upon the weak. If there is a lesson to be learned from these blood-soaked pages of history, it is that we must remain vigilant against our own worst impulses and strive to build a society where such want and cruelty are consigned to the past. A world where justice is tempered by mercy, and where we need not fear the sword or the stake. It is a noble goal, if perhaps an elusive one. But as we drift off to sleep, let us dream of that better world and resolve to contribute our small part in making it a reality. Let the grim spectres of the breaking wheel and the boiling cauldron fade into the mists of history, and let us embrace a future where every life is cherished and none need live in fear of such horrors. For even the most hardened medieval executioner was once a child who dreamed of a gentler world. Perhaps by honoring that innocent yearning, we can finally lay the ghosts of their victims to rest and build a society worthy of their memory. A society where cruelty is the exception, not the rule, and where justice is tempered by wisdom and compassion. It's a beautiful thought to fall asleep to, isn't it? As we drift into slumber, the world gradually turns towards the light. With each passing generation, we move further away from the shadows of the dungeon and closer to a world where every life holds sacred value. Therefore, let us bid farewell to the spectres of history, secure in the knowledge that their suffering was not in vain. By remembering their fates, we honor their lives and recommit ourselves to constructing a world where such horrors become mere fading nightmares, banished by the dawn of a brighter day. Rest well, dear listener, and dream of a kinder, gentler world that awaits us. As we've witnessed, the medieval period was an era marked by harsh justice and brutal punishments. Public humiliation, torture, and gruesome executions were commonplace, instilling fear in would-be criminals and the general populace alike. One notorious method of execution that combined slow, agonizing death with public spectacle was being hanged, drawn, and quartered. This punishment was reserved for the most severe crimes, specifically high treason against the king. The appalling process commenced with the condemned being tied to a wooden hurdle and dragged by a horse to the execution site, often over rough cobblestones that left them bruised and bloodied before reaching the gallows. Once there, the victim was hanged by the neck but cut down while still alive. Then the true brutality commenced. The executioner would slice open their abdomen, sever their entrails and genitals, and toss them into a fire. The crowd would watch in morbid fascination as the prisoner's organs burned, and they slowly succumbed to shock and blood loss. But the ordeal was far from over. Finally, their body would be cut into quarters, chopped apart with an axe. The severed heads were often sent to various parts of the country to serve as a grim warning against treason. Among those who suffered this atrocious fate is William Wallace, the Scottish rebel leader famously portrayed by Mel Gibson in the film Braveheart. Wallace, a formidable figure, stood as a persistent adversary to English rule, leading a valiant resistance against their occupation of Scotland during the late 13th century. After years of relentless guerrilla warfare, Wallace's fate was sealed when he was captured and brought to London to face the wrath of King Edward I. Defiant to the very end, Wallace refused to acknowledge the English king's authority and submit to his rule over Scotland. This defiance led to his condemnation as a traitor, and he was sentenced to be hanged, drawn, and quartered. In August 1305, Wallace was dragged through the streets of London to the Elms at Smithfield. There he was hanged but cut down while still alive. As he lay dazed, his abdomen was sliced open, and his entrails were pulled out before his very eyes. The flames of a fire consumed the remains, and it is said that Wallace uttered his final words as he succumbed to his injuries. "I could not be a traitor to Edward, for I was never his subject." With his intestines smouldering, Wallace finally expired. His body was then dismembered into 4 pieces. His preserved head was impaled on a spike and displayed at London Bridge as a grim warning to other Scots. His limbs were sent to Newcastle, Berwick, Stirling, and Perth, further instilling fear and discouraging any further rebellion. Wallace's gruesome execution may have elevated him to the status of a martyr, but it also served as a temporary deterrent to further Scottish resistance. However, the brutality of his death, even by medieval standards, exposed the true cruelty of the era's justice system. In an age before the advent of more humane capital punishment methods, like the guillotine, being hanged, drawn, and quartered was undoubtedly the most agonizing and degrading way to meet one's end. As the 14th century dawned, such savagery gradually gave way to more expedient executions. Hanging until death became the preferred method, replacing the prolonged suffering of drawing and quartering. This shift reflected a subtle change in societal attitudes, a recognition that a swift and merciful death was sufficient punishment without the need for additional torment and mutilation. Nevertheless, the medieval period will forever be etched in history as a time of severe and brutal justice. Most punishments were not merely meant to punish the criminal, but also to serve as a public spectacle. Whether it was languishing in the stocks, enduring torture, or being disemboweled before a bloodthirsty crowd, those who transgressed the law faced fates far more severe than any modern prisoner. While the brutality of the Middle Ages may make us shudder today, it is crucial to comprehend the context of that era. Life was often harsh, brutish, and short for medieval commoners. Violence and death were inescapable realities. The cruelty of the justice system mirrored the harshness of society as a whole. In some ways, the most extreme punishments were a means of maintaining law and order in a chaotic and cutthroat world. Nevertheless, we can be grateful that justice has evolved to be more fair and humane over the centuries since medieval times. No longer do petty criminals risk having their hands chopped off or being boiled alive for their offences. The gallows and chopping block have been relegated to the annals of history in much of the world. Today's punishments are designed to be proportionate to the crime, rather than being excessive displays of state power and cruelty. While learning about the most gruesome tortures and executions of the Middle Ages can be morbidly intriguing, it also serves as a reminder of how far we have progressed. The next time you hear about a criminal receiving a comparatively lenient sentence, remember that they might have been publicly disemboweled and torn limb from limb in the past. Regardless of the challenges faced by the modern justice system, we can appreciate that it is a far cry from the merciless brutality of medieval times. As you drift off to sleep, take solace in knowing that you live in a gentler age where horrendous fates like being hanged, drawn, and quartered are confined to the pages of history books and the realm of dark bedtime tales. The ghastly spectres of the torturer and executioner have largely been laid to rest, allowing us to sleep a little sounder. Let us rest well and dream of a world that, despite its flaws, is kinder and more just than the distant past. Good night. As the blazing flames consumed her, the young maiden's agonized shrieks pierced the night air. Smoke stung the eyes of onlookers as it billowed into the starry sky. Though Joan of Arc's end was horrific, her legacy would endure long after the charred embers of the P. In the centuries that followed, she would be hailed as a French heroine and ultimately canonized as a saint. Her indomitable spirit could never be extinguished. The breaking wheel was another gruesome execution method reserved for the most despised criminals. The condemned would be stretched out on a large wagon wheel, limbs spread and tied along the spokes. With slow, methodical swings, the executioner would shatter the victim's bones with a heavy iron cudgel. The awful crunching of pulverized limbs and anguished cries rent the air. After the dreadful deed was done, the mangled bodies were often left tied to the wheel and hoisted up on a tall pole, serving as a grim warning to other would-be malfeasants. Crows would peck at the flesh of these wretches as they expired in slow agony under the merciless sun. One can only imagine the baleful stares of their lifeless eyes, silently warning passers-by against the steep cost of wickedness. Among the most vicious execution methods was being boiled alive. The accused, often coin forgers or poisoners, would be submerged in a great cauldron of scalding water, oil, or even molten lead in some cases. As one might expect, the shrieks of these ill-fated souls were said to be almost unbearable to witness. In 1542, Margaret Davy, a servant in England, met such a macabre demise. She was convicted of fatally poisoning her master, John Burl. For this treacherous act, the sentence was to be boiled to death at Smithfield. As she thrashed and howled in the bubbling vat, the ghastly scene must have left an indelible mark on all who witnessed it. Her blistered skin peeled away in gruesome strips as the life force ebbed away from her broiled body. Hanging, drawing and quartering, arguably the most atrocious and demeaning of all execution methods, was reserved for the heinous crime of treason against the crown. This unholy trinity of capital punishment was a prolonged ritual of butchery designed to inflict the utmost suffering and shame. The accused traitor would first be hoisted to the gallows by a hurdle or wooden panel, often upside down, as jeering crowds pelted them with rotten fruit and manure. A noose would then be tightened around their neck, but not so much as to mercifully break it. They would be slowly hoisted up to strangle, but cut down before death could claim them. What followed was a veritable abattoir of horrors. The condemned would be disemboweled alive, their entrails yanked out and tossed into a fire. The executioner would then hack the body into 4 pieces with an axe. Often the head would be dipped in tar to preserve it, then mounted on a spike as a warning to other potential traitors. The remaining severed quarters of flesh might be sent to the far corners of the kingdom as a grim display of the sovereign's wrath. Perhaps the most renowned recipient of this brutal punishment was Scottish knight William Wallace, known as Braveheart. In the late 13th century, he led a bloody rebellion against English rule. After his capture, Wallace was condemned to be hanged, drawn and quartered for high treason against King Edward I. According to contemporary accounts, Wallace was dragged naked by a horse to the Elms at Smithfield. There, he was hanged but cut loose while still alive. His genitals were cut off and burned before his eyes. His belly was then sliced open, and his intestines and heart were torn out. As a final insult, Wallace's decapitated head was displayed on London Bridge, while his limbs were showcased in Newcastle, Berwick, Stirling, and Perth as a stark warning to potential agitators. Despite his mortal form being desecrated, William Wallace's fierce Scottish pride endured for generations. Medieval executions, characterized by flaming peas and bubbling cauldrons, were a macabre spectacle of cruelty that showcased the savagery of that era's justice system. These harrowing punishments, though abhorrent to modern sensibilities, were widely accepted as a part of civilized society for centuries. Rulers employed these ghastly public spectacles to assert their power, deter crime, and suppress dissent among their subjects. We've come a long way since those dark days when a merciful end was not a right but an expensive privilege. Today, the notion of death by torture, of having one's limbs pulverized and trails ripped out before a cheering crowd, seems not just macabre but unthinkable. How fortunate we are to live in more enlightened times when human dignity is an inalienable truth and justice, though still imperfect, strives for impartiality and clemency. As we drift off to sleep, perhaps we should spare a thought for those unfortunate souls of yesteryear, the broken, the burned, the boiled, and the butchered. Despite their immense suffering, they were no less human than we who slumber peacefully in the present. In our dreams, let us grant them the mercy and grace that their own era so cruelly denied them. Let us always remember the harsh reality of humanity we now cherish and the barbarism we've thankfully left behind. Good night, dear listener, and may your dreams be gentle and just. For though the arc of history is long, it bends ever towards kindness and light. In that comforting thought, let us find our rest, sleep well until the dawn of a better tomorrow. As the gruesome spectacle of William Wallace's execution fades into history, we turn now to consider the broader tapestry of medieval justice. These ghastly punishments, as horrifying as they appear to modern sensibilities, were all too common in an era when brutality was the norm and human life was often disregarded. For the ruling classes of medieval Europe, torture and execution served as both a means of maintaining order and a form of grim entertainment. Noble lords and ladies would gather to watch the suffering of the condemned, sipping wine and gossiping as if attending a sporting event. The elaborate rituals of public execution, involving processions through town squares and staged displays of agony, functioned as a kind of grisly theatre for the masses. However, not all victims of medieval justice were common criminals or political dissidents. In an era of religious fervor and superstition, accusations of heresy and witchcraft ran rampant across Europe, with the Inquisition burning brightly as alleged practitioners of the dark arts were rounded up and subjected to brutal interrogation. One of the most infamous cases was that of the Knights Templar, a powerful Catholic military order that fell from grace in spectacular fashion. In 1307, King Philip IV of France, deeply indebted to the wealthy Templars, ordered the arrest of their leaders on charges of heresy, blasphemy, and homosexuality. Under torture, many of the knights confessed to spitting on the cross and worshipping a demonic idol named Baphomet. Initially, the Templars' Grandmaster, Jacques de Molay, admitted to these charges after being stretched on the rack, but later recanted his confession. Enraged, King Philip had him slow-roasted over a fire in front of the Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris. As the flames consumed his flesh, de Molay reportedly cried out a curse on the king and Pope Clement V, summoning them to face divine judgment within a year. Eerily, both men would be dead before the year was out. The grim fate of the Templars underscores the intricate web of politics, religion, and sadism that characterized much of medieval justice. In an era dominated by absolute monarchs and powerful clergy, charges of treason and heresy were frequently employed as a pretext to eliminate rivals and seize assets. The machinery of torture and execution became a tool for consolidating the power of the ruling elite. Despite our revulsion at the cruelty of these practices, it's crucial to understand their historical context. Life in the Middle Ages was often harsh and short, with violence and suffering being inescapable realities for a significant portion of the population. In a world plagued by war, famine, and plague, the severe punishments inflicted by authorities may have appeared as a necessary deterrent against chaos and anarchy. Moreover, concepts of individual rights and due process were centuries away from being legally recognized. The notion that every person accused of a crime deserved a fair trial and freedom from torture would have seemed utterly foreign to the medieval mindset. Justice was swift, merciless, and often arbitrary, with the whims of lords and bishops wielding the power of law. However, as the Middle Ages transitioned into the Renaissance and Enlightenment, attitudes began to shift. Thinkers like Voltaire and Beccaria advocated for a more humane and rational approach to justice, one that respected the inherent dignity of the individual. Gradually, the most egregious excesses of medieval punishment began to fade into history. Today, we look back on the torture chambers and execution squares of the Middle Ages with a profound sense of horror and revulsion. Nevertheless, the legacy of those dark times persists in various ways. The use of torture as a tool of state power endured well into the modern era. From the dungeons of totalitarian regimes to the waterboarding of terror suspects in the 21st century, the practice continues to haunt us. Even in ostensibly democratic societies, the justice system can still be used as a weapon against the vulnerable and marginalized. The disproportionate incarceration and capital punishment of racial minorities, the mistreatment of prisoners in sprawling jail complexes, and the denial of due process to enemy combatants all reflect the cruel logic of the medieval era. As we drift off to sleep, let us confront these uncomfortable truths and commit to building a future driven by mercy, compassion, and human rights. Only by acknowledging the darkness of our past can we hope to create a brighter future. The noble aspiration of a society governed by justice, rather than brutality, remains elusive. but it is a dream worth fighting for now and in all future generations. So, let us bid farewell to the haunting spectres of the Middle Ages, confident that their ghostly chains need not bind us forever. In the gentle embrace of slumber, we can envision a world where cruelty is banished and every human life is revered as sacred. A world where the only confinement is the cozy confines of our bedchambers, and the only sentence is a long and restful night's sleep. Sleep well, dear listener, and dream of better days ahead. Although the history of humanity is long, it consistently bends towards justice, and each morning brings a new dawn, washing away the blood and tears of the past. In this grand turning of the ages, you too have a role to play, if only to bear witness, to remember, and to hope. Good night, and may your dreams be gentle. As we've seen, the breaking wheel was a particularly gruesome and inhumane medieval execution method reserved for the most despised criminals. The condemned would be tied spread-eagle to a large wooden wagon wheel, their limbs stretched out along the spokes. The executioner would then methodically use a heavy iron hammer or bar to smash the victim's bones, beginning with the ankles and wrists and working inward. Each sickening crunch of splintering bone would be accompanied by the agonized screams of the condemned echoing through the town square. Some would succumb to shock and blood loss, mercifully falling unconscious, while others endured the excruciating ordeal to the bitter end. With limbs shattered, their broken bodies were woven through the spokes of a wheel and hoisted up on a tall pole, left on grotesque display as a warning to other would-be criminals. One of the most infamous cases of this macabre practice was the execution of Peter Stump in 1589. Accused of being a serial killer and werewolf who preyed on the villages of Bedburg, Stump was subjected to torture. Under the pressure, he confessed to murdering and cannibalizing 14 children, including his own son, as well as practicing black magic and engaging in a liaison with a succubus. Stump's execution was as brutal as his alleged crimes. Flesh was torn from his body with red-hot pincers before he was strapped to a breaking wheel. His limbs were systematically pulverized, but he remained conscious throughout, wailing in agony until an executioner finally beheaded him with a merciful stroke of the axe. His mangled corpse was burned at the stake along with his daughter and mistress, who were deemed accomplices in his sorcery. While modern scholars question the legitimacy of Stump's confessions and the fairness of his trial, his ghastly fate upon the breaking wheel became an enduring part of werewolf lore and German folklore. His grisly demise stood as a vivid example of the cruel ingenuity of medieval executions. However, even the breaking wheel pales in comparison to perhaps the most viscerally horrific execution method of the Middle Ages, boiling alive. The condemned was immersed in a large cauldron of water, oil, tar, or even molten lead, slowly being cooked to death over an open fire. The liquid would gradually scald and blister the skin, slouging it from the flesh as the victim writhed and shrieked, the gruesome stench of boiling human fat filling the air. As with being burned at the stake, the torturous execution of boiling to death could be excruciatingly prolonged, depending on the temperature of the liquid and the height from which the victim was suspended. Some individuals succumbed swiftly to shock, while others endured unspeakable suffering for up to 2 hours before finally succumbing. In England, boiling to death was a rare but documented punishment for poisoners and counterfeits from the 12th through 16th centuries. One of the earliest recorded instances occurred in 1222, when a man was boiled alive for poisoning a well during the reign of King Henry III. A cook convicted of poisoning the household of the Bishop of Rochester met the same gruesome fate by being boiled in 1532. Perhaps the most infamous case involved Richard Roos, the cook for the household of the Bishop of Rochester. In 1532, Roos was convicted of high treason for attempting to poison the bishop and his guests by adding a white powdery substance to a pot of porridge. Although the motive behind his actions remained unclear and the poison may have been accidental, one of the bishop's servants died and others fell violently ill. By the standards of the time, his crime of treasonous poisoning warranted extraordinary punishment. Consequently, Roos was sentenced to be boiled to death without benefit of clergy. Chronicles describe how he was stripped naked, suspended by his waist with ropes over a scalding cauldron, and gradually lowered into the boiling liquid. His agonized screams filled the air, and his skin sloughed off in gruesome sheets until he finally expired in the bubbling stew of his own making. The public spectacle of Rose being boiled alive reportedly drew a large, ghoulishly enthusiastic crowd to Smithfield that day. However, it also marked the final instance of boiling to death in England. The cruel practice was abolished by King Henry VIII later that same year in 1532. Stewing and boiling liquid was a longer and arguably even more agonizing method of execution compared to burning at the stake. The victim would endure searing, blistering torment, with their skin peeling away for up to 2 agonizing hours before succumbing to shock or the fatal rupture of their organs. The psychological dread of waiting in anguish for their demise must have been equally unimaginable. Thus concluded the brief yet horrific era of boiling alive in England. While only a few unfortunate souls met this gruesome fate, their suffering was said to be among the most severe of the already barbaric standards of medieval execution. The terrifying image of the boiling cauldron joined the ranks of the breaking wheel and the stake in history's annals of most dreadful punishments. However, perhaps the grimmest and most ignominious execution of all was reserved for the most heinous crime a medieval citizen could commit: high treason against the crown. The disloyalty and betrayal of treason warranted a special kind of retribution, a soul-destroyingly brutal and humiliating death known as hanging, drawing, and quartering. This gory practice first emerged in 13th century England as a means to literally and figuratively unmake a traitor. The public spectacle commenced with the accused being tied to a wooden hurdle and drawn through the streets by a horse to the execution site, typically a central square. Jeering crowds would hurl rotten vegetables and stones at the condemned, adding to their humiliation and torment. Upon reaching the scaffold, the prisoner would be hanged by the neck, but cut down before death, merely to induce strangulation and near unconsciousness. Then the true cruelty commenced. Executioners would slice open the victim's abdomen, severing their intestines and genitals, and toss them into a fire. The agony of disemboweling would jolt many back to consciousness, allowing them to witness their own innards burning. Finally, the head was severed, and the body was hacked into 4 pieces, symbolizing the traitor's attempt to divide the kingdom. The severed head of a condemned individual would be dipped in tar and displayed on London Bridge or another prominent gate, serving as a gruesome reminder of the king's wrath. Similarly, the quartered body parts of the victim would be sent to the far corners of the realm as a warning to others. Throughout England's medieval political intrigues, hundreds of victims endured the gruesome punishment of hanging, drawing, and quartering. Among them, the Scottish knight William Wallace stands out as a particularly famous figure. Wallace led the Scottish resistance against English occupation and gained widespread recognition through the film Braveheart. After being captured after a fierce battle, he was condemned to a traitor's execution in London. Following his capture, Wallace was dragged behind horses to the gallows and hanged by the neck. However, he was cut down while still alive. The exact order of his mutilations varies among accounts. Some claim he was castrated, disemboweled, and beheaded. Others report that his stomach was sliced open first, allowing him to witness the burning of his entrails before his genitals were cut off and his heart was ripped out. Regardless of the precise sequence, all agree that the process was extremely gory and brutal, even by the cruel standards of the time. After his death, Wallace's body was hacked into pieces. His head was displayed on London Bridge, while his limbs were exhibited in Newcastle, Berwick, Stirling, and Perth as a warning to other Scots who might oppose English rule. The drawing and quartering of William Wallace served as a high-profile example of the political barbarism of the medieval era. During this period, the state aimed not only to execute traitors, but also to utterly destroy them through humiliation, mutilation, and dispersal. While hanging, drawing, and quartering was nominally abolished in England in 1870, it had largely fallen out of practice long before then. The last execution under this brutal punishment took place in 1782. The condemned individual was allowed to hang until death before being posthumously cut down and beheaded, which was considered a small mercy. By the 19th century, political violence had become widely regarded as distasteful and uncivilized. Consequently, the state's justice system evolved to favor swift, simpler, and less gruesome forms of capital punishment. Thus, the long and grim history of England's most infamous execution method, hanging, drawing, and quartering, came to an end. For centuries, it had stood as the ultimate punishment for traitors. This spectacle of suffering was not only meant to inflict physical pain, but also to torment the soul, instill fear in the living, and desecrate the dead. Like the breaking wheel, boiling alive, and other notorious tortures of the medieval era, it has faded into the darker corners of history, serving as a haunting reminder of a crueler time when horrific pain and humiliation were the price of betraying one's king. As we delve into the darkest corners of the Middle Ages, a recurring theme emerges: the use of spectacular public violence to exert social and political control. Brutal executions were not merely acts of punishment, they were powerful messages sent to the masses. Gruesome displays of the consequences of crime aimed to shock and instill fear, compelling people to obey the state, church, and monarch. However, this extreme cruelty also reflected the precariousness of those medieval power structures. In an era plagued by widespread poverty, inequality, and discontent, authorities lived in constant fear of rebellion and dissent from the populace. They understood that the commoners outnumbered the elites, and that the people could rise up if pushed too far. Therefore, gruesome executions served as a means of asserting dominance and intimidating the citizenry into submission. The psychology of the crowd at public executions was a complex and intriguing phenomenon. While many likely watched with genuine horror, others found a strange sense of grim satisfaction or even entertainment in the proceedings. Public mutilation and killing offered a brief respite and spectacle in lives that were otherwise short, arduous, and dreary. The community united to collectively purge a transgressor, scapegoat an evil, and vicariously experience primal human fascinations with violence and death. Public executions also catered to the innate human desire for moral superiority. By physically placing a condemned criminal below them on the scaffold, the masses could feel righteous and worthy in comparison, even as they reveled in the gruesome spectacle. It provided a way to comprehend a harsh world and find symbolic justice in punishing others. However, not all executions were primarily about justice, as seen in the case of many accused heretics and religious minorities. The gruesome killing of Jews, Muslims, and accused witches was more about enforcing social conformity and purity than punishing any actual crime. Prejudice and paranoia fueled witch hunts and pogroms, with torture-induced confessions justifying horrific ends. The visceral suffering of burning symbolized the eternal hellfire supposedly awaiting those who deviated from the one true faith. Despite their brutality, public punishments could also evoke some sympathy for the condemned. Witnessing extreme agony had a way of humanizing even the most heinous criminals. Some particularly prolonged executions, such as the botched burning of a penitent woman or the stoic resignation of a beloved community healer accused of witchcraft, could elicit a disturbing mix of grim satisfaction and uneasy pity in observers. This unsettling sense of complicity and shame gradually eroded public appetite for the most brutal medieval execution methods. The Enlightenment introduced new ideas about the state's right to torture and kill citizens. Reformers argued that if the people were the ultimate source of government authority, the justice system should reflect the people's evolving sense of decency and humanity. It became apparent that it was hypocritical for the state to punish murder with even more gruesome premeditated murder. Ritual mutilation and execution were confined to the walls of prisons, becoming more sanitized and bureaucratized. The public spectacle shifted from the destruction of the criminal's body to the solemn dignity of the legal process itself. Modern executions, such as lethal injection, minimize physical suffering and disorder, concealing the messier biological realities of death. This allows the state to execute individuals while maintaining a facade of moral rationality and decorum. The cold clinical detachment of modern capital punishment contrasts sharply with the visceral gore and clamor of the medieval gallows and scaffold. We have come a long way from the days when a convict's entrails were ripped out and displayed before a cheering crowd. However, we still grapple with fundamental questions about crime, punishment, and the state's right to kill in the name of justice. While our sanitized executions behind prison walls may spare us the messy brutality of the past, they may also prevent us from fully comprehending the gravity and enormity of the act. In a sense, the sheer horror of medieval punishments compelled society to confront the human costs of harsh justice in all its brutality and agony. A burning or beheading was impossible to ignore, and its memory burned itself into the minds of all who witnessed it. Therefore, there may be some value and necessity in revisiting these dark chapters of history, not to revel in the gore and suffering, but to remember the human capacity for both cruelty and endurance in the face of it. The tortured bodies and souls of the Middle Ages still offer valuable lessons about the ongoing struggle to balance justice, morality, and power in our imperfect human societies. While these dreadful torments may be consigned to history, their echoes persist in our cultural consciousness and continue to shape our ongoing debates over crime and punishment. We are not so far removed from the medieval executioner's scaffold as we might think. However, by remembering the darkest aspects of our past, we can recommit to building a future characterized by wisdom, mercy, and enlightenment. As history has shown, the medieval era was marked by harsh justice and brutal punishments. Even minor offenses could lead to severe consequences, and the most heinous offenders faced unimaginable cruelty. Public humiliation, torture, and execution were commonplace in an age where life was often harsh, brutish, and short. One of the most influential figures in shaping medieval justice was King Henry II of England. Born in 1133, Henry was a powerful and ambitious monarch, determined to strengthen royal authority and establish a centralized legal system. He implemented several key legal reforms, including the introduction of trial by jury and the appointment of professional judges to oversee cases. These reforms laid the foundation for English common law, which would later influence legal systems worldwide. However, Henry's legacy is not without controversy. Like many medieval rulers, he could be ruthless in dealing with those who opposed him. In 1170, he famously clashed with Thomas Becket, the Archbishop of Canterbury, over the rights and privileges of the Church. According to contemporary accounts, an enraged Henry allegedly uttered words interpreted as a command to kill Becket. 4 knights loyal to the king rode to Canterbury Cathedral, where they brutally murdered the archbishop as he prayed at the altar. Becket's martyrdom sent shockwaves through medieval Europe and left a lasting stain on Henry's reputation. As a form of penance for his role in Becket's death, Henry was compelled to perform a public act of humiliation. In 1174, he walked barefoot through the streets of Canterbury while being flogged by a group of monks. This act of contrition may seem extreme by today's standards, but it reflects the widespread religiosity of the era and the belief in the power of public penance. Of course, not all punishments in medieval times were as high profile. For most ordinary people, the reality of justice was far more mundane, though no less brutal. Petty criminals and social outcasts were often subjected to a range of public humiliations designed to shame and ostracize them from the community. Imagine, if you will, a young man named Thomas, a peasant living in a small English village in the 13th century. Thomas had been caught stealing a loaf of bread from the local baker, driven by hunger and desperation. As punishment, he was sentenced to a day in the stocks, a wooden device that restrained the hands and feet, leaving the offender vulnerable to public ridicule. Picture Thomas as he was led out into the village square, his head and hands locked into the heavy wooden frame. A jeering crowd gathered around him, armed with rotten fruit and vegetables, mud, and even stones. For hours, Thomas endured a barrage of filth and abuse, his face and clothes spattered with the foul-smelling detritus. As the sun began to set, Thomas was finally released from the stocks, his limbs aching and his spirit broken. He slouched off towards home, the taunts and laughter of the crowd still ringing in his ears. For a simple act of theft, he had been subjected to a brutal and humiliating ordeal that would mark him as a social pariah for years to come. Thomas's story is fictional, but it reflects the grim realities faced by countless ordinary people in medieval times. For those on the fringes of society, even a minor transgression could result in severe and lasting punishment. In a world where starvation and deprivation were commonplace, the theft of a loaf of bread could be seen as a serious crime against the social order. However, public humiliation was just one of many cruel punishments inflicted in the name of justice. In the dimly lit corners of medieval dungeons and torture chambers, those accused of more severe offenses faced even more dreadful fates. The punishments endured or witnessed by spectators in jeering crowds must have been unimaginable. We've explored some of the most gruesome and cruel punishments inflicted upon the condemned during medieval times. From the excruciating hours spent on the wheel to the terrifying walk to meet the executioner's axe or burning pyre, these high-profile methods were undoubtedly brutal. However, we shouldn't overlook the prolonged suffering inflicted by lesser punishments. Devices like the stocks and pillories may not have resulted in immediate death, but they subjected their occupants to deep shame and disgrace, leaving a lasting impact that lingered long after the rotten vegetables were washed away. Imagine the life of a petty thief in a medieval town, caught stealing a loaf of bread to feed his starving family. Dragged before the local magistrate, he was sentenced to a day in the stocks. As the rough wooden planks closed around his wrists and ankles, he was utterly helpless, unable to hide his face or escape the angry mob that soon surrounded him. For hours, he endured a barrage of insults, rotten food, and even rocks and waste hurled by the pent-up citizens, unleashing their disdain. The putrid stench of spoiled produce mingled with his own sweat, tears, and filth. Although his body might leave the stocks after a day, the shame and humiliation branded him more permanently than even the marks of a hot iron. He would carry this disgrace like a scarlet letter, and of course those hot iron brands were all too real for many unfortunate individuals. While the story of Hester Prynne and her scarlet letter may be fictional, the practice of marking adulterers, thieves, and other undesirables with searing metal was a stark reality. One can only imagine the agony as the glowing iron bit into tender flesh, sizzling and scorching the skin. The acrid scent of burning meat, the tortured screams, and the struggle to remain still to prevent the brand from blurring and necessitating a second application. After the physical pain subsided into a dull, persistent throb, the victim was left with an unmistakable badge of ignominy. It was excruciating to live with one's worst mistake or lowest moment literally burned into one's skin for all to see and judge. In an era when honor and reputation held immense significance, a brand was almost a fate worse than death. Speaking of fates worse than death, the mere mention of medieval torture chambers sends shivers down one's spine. These dank, shadowy dungeons, the stuff of nightmares and modern horror movies, were all too real for the unfortunate souls imprisoned there. The squalid stone walls, damp with mold and moss, echoed with the anguished cries of those enduring unimaginable agonies. Rusting iron cages suspended from the ceiling, ominous wooden racks with leather straps to stretch out limbs, and even iron maidens lined with vicious spikes were all common sights in the medieval torturer's toolkit. Among these devices, the infamous rack stood out as one of the most dreaded. Imagine being led into the clammy chamber, trembling with terror as leather cuffs are fastened around your wrists and ankles. You stare up at the thick wooden rollers, knowing that with each turn, your limbs will be stretched farther apart. Sinuous strain, tendons pop, joints crackle, and threaten to dislocate as the splintering pain intensifies. How long could you endure such torment? How long before you are compelled to confess to whatever accusations your tormentors level against you? True or not, the tragic case of an Askew comes to mind. During the reign of Henry VIII, she was subjected to the rack for her Protestant beliefs. Despite her limbs being stretched until her hips and knees were torn from their sockets, she refused to name others who shared her faith. Her remarkable resilience may have ultimately led to her execution at the stake as an unrepentant heretic. In an era when justice was often harsh and evidence was unreliable, false confessions were unfortunately common. The rack, in particular, had a notorious reputation for coercing the accused into admitting to anything simply to alleviate the excruciating pain. Once a confession was obtained, regardless of its truthfulness, the prisoner's fate was usually sealed. A public execution awaited, whether by the relatively swift and merciful method of beheading or by slower, more agonizing means designed to inflict maximum suffering and serve as a warning to potential criminals. For those of noble birth or high status, the sword or axe was the customary instrument of execution. In theory, decapitation was a swift death, achieved with a single decisive stroke that severed the head from the body. However, the grim reality often deviated from this ideal. Consider the tragic case of Mary, Queen of Scots. Condemned to death for conspiring against her cousin, Queen Elizabeth I, Mary faced the block with remarkable poise and dignity. Adorned in a vibrant red gown to conceal any bloodstains, she composed herself as she knelt and placed her head on the stump. What should have been a solemn and swift execution turned into a gruesome spectacle as the executioner's initial strike missed her neck and struck the back of her head. A shocked gasp rippled through the crowd. The second blow severed most of her neck, but failed to fully decapitate her. Only with a third strike could the axeman finally hack through the last sinew and gristle. As he lifted the severed head to the crowd, Mary's pained expression and lips continued to silently pray, bearing witness to a botched and excruciating end that was far from befitting a queen. For commoners, hanging was a more common and usually more predictable sentence, albeit no less gruesome. The condemned would be led to a tall wooden gallows, their hands bound and a rough hemp noose draped heavily around their neck. A hooded executioner, a priest offering last rites, and a solemn crowd of stern-faced witnesses set the stage for this grim spectacle. The trap door would creak open, plunging the condemned through to dangle at the end of the rope. If the fall was long enough and the noose positioned correctly, death would come swiftly as the neck snapped. However, more often, the victim would kick and struggle, a macabre dance of futile resistance. Slowly they would strangulate to death, their bulging eyes and protruding tongue betraying their agony as the minutes dragged on. The crowd watched solemnly until the twitching ceased, and it was clear that the deed was done. Death by hanging, the ignoble end reserved for thieves, brigands, and peasant rabble. Pressing or crushing, another grim method of execution, was reserved for specific offences. Those who refused to enter a plea during their trial could be subjected to painful and forceful punishment to compel them to speak. The accused would be laid on their back naked, a heavy board placed across their chest. Weights or stones would then be piled on one by one, slowly constricting their breathing as the immense pressure mounted. The ordeal could last for hours or even days, with more and more weight compressing the chest and vital organs. Shallow, labored breaths would grow further apart, ribs would splinter and crack, lungs would collapse, and the heart would strain to beat under the crushing load. Eventually, the poor soul would either gasp out a plea or succumb to the slow agony of suffocation. One of the most infamous cases of pressing was that of Margaret Clio, executed in this excruciating manner in 1586. Her crime involved harbouring Catholic priests during a time when Catholicism was outlawed in England. Stripped and laid between two doors, she was crushed under 800 pounds of rocks over the course of 15 minutes. Before her death, her last words were to pray for the Queen's salvation. Her unwavering faith in the face of such brutality eventually led to her beatification as a martyr. Burning at the stake was another particularly dreadful way to die, the visceral opposite of the holy cremation that marked an exalted end in some cultures. In medieval Europe, death by burning was reserved for sins of the soul and crimes against the church, punishments for heretics, blasphemers, and unrepentant witches. The condemned would be led to a towering pyre stacked high with bundles of dry kindling and tar-soaked logs. A stout wooden post rose from the center, adorned with iron shackles or chains. As the prisoner was bound tightly to the stake, priests would make one final attempt to extract a confession and reconciliation with the church, the only path to salvation for their mortal soul. Whether they recanted or stood firm, the results were the same. Unforgiving flames would soon envelop them. Imagine the tremendous heat from the roaring blaze lapping at your skin, scorching your feet, and searing your lungs. Cinders and sparks stung your eyes as stinging acid smoke clogged your nostrils. As tongues of fire licked higher, they blistered and blackened the skin, rupturing and peeling it away in gory flaps and strips. One can only pray that the costal smoke suffocates and kills before the flames fully engulf the body. Such was the torturous fate of the famous Joan of Arc, the defiant young maiden who led the French army against the English. Condemned as a heretic for her brazen rebellion and insistence on male dress, she was burned at the stake in 1431 at the tender age of 19. In a final act of cruelty, her executioners relit the flames when she was on the brink of death so the gathered crowd could witness her demise. Her anguished cries of Jesus echoed in the square long after the pyre collapsed to ash and embers. The rare punishment of boiling alive was every bit as shuddersome as burning, and then some. In England, prisoners who committed heinous crimes such as treason, murder, or even coin counterfeiting faced a grim fate. They could be condemned to death by boiling in water or oil. One of the most infamous cases involved Richard Roos, the cook of an English bishop. Roos was convicted of poisoning his master and several other unfortunate diners. His sentence was to be executed at London's notorious execution site, Smithfield, by boiling to death. In 1532, a massive cauldron was constructed and filled with boiling water. Roos was suspended by his torso and repeatedly plunged into the scalding liquid. Over an agonizing hour, his flesh was literally boiled away from his bones. The excruciating pain was unimaginable, with skin peeling away, eyes and mouth searing. Each desperate gasp for air only intensified the agony, scalding the throat and filling the lungs. Witnesses undoubtedly recoiled from the horrific shrieks and the grim stench of cooking flesh. However, the gruesome sight was etched into their memories as a chilling warning against the unimaginable suffering awaiting traitors. Perhaps the most elaborate and gruesome form of execution was the infamous practice of being hanged, drawn, and quartered. This was the ultimate punishment for high treason against the crown, usually reserved for rebels or conspirators against the king. The condemned man would be dragged to the gallows on a slatted wooden hurdle pulled by a horse. Already brutalized and bloodied by the rough journey, he would be hanged by the neck but cut down while still alive. The subsequent gruesome butchering and dismemberment shocked even the most hardened executioners and onlookers. As the prisoner lay dazed and struggling on the blood-slick platform, the executioner would skillfully slice open his abdomen with practiced cuts. Reaching inside the gaping cavity, he would extract fistfuls of slippery, steaming entrails and toss them into a waiting cauldron. The man's screams of agony pierced the air, soon transforming into guttural gurgles as he choked on his own blood. However, the ordeal was far from over. With the victim in shock and mercifully unconscious, the executioner would swiftly hack off his head with an axe and hold it aloft for the cheering crowd. Subsequently, the arms and legs were severed, leaving behind a mutilated and unrecognizable torso. In a final act of desecration, the head and limbs were often dipped in tar and displayed at the city gates or other public locations as a grim warning to others. The renowned Scottish freedom fighter William Wallace allegedly met this gruesome fate after leading a rebellion against English rule in the 13th century. After being captured and tried in London for high treason, Wallace was hanged until nearly dead, then cut down and disemboweled while still conscious. His organs burned before his eyes. Finally, he was beheaded and quartered, his severed head dipped in tar and mounted on a spike at the top of London Bridge. His 4 limbs were sent to the far corners of Britain as a stark warning against treason and defiance of the English crown. As we reflect upon these brutal scenes and shudder-inducing accounts, it's natural to experience a mix of horror, revulsion, and perhaps even morbid curiosity. The dark chapters of history captivate us with their grim fascination. Even as they repel us with their cruelty, it's challenging to comprehend the depths of suffering inflicted upon one another in the name of justice, religion, or social order. However, we must remember that these stomach-churning punishments, as horrific as they appear to our modern sensibilities, were very much a product of their time. In an era characterized by harsh living conditions, superstition, and grinding poverty, justice was equally unforgiving. The methods of torture and execution we've described were considered essential for maintaining law and order, deterring crime, and punishing those who defied God or the king. They served as a stark reminder of the immense power wielded by the state and the church, highlighting the severe consequences of defying their authority. Notably, many of these gruesome practices persisted well beyond the medieval era. While the Middle Ages are often depicted as a particularly barbaric and backward time, the truth is that torture, mutilation, and gruesome executions continued into the early modern period, spanning from the 1500s to the 1800s. For instance, the rack was still in use during the Tudor era in England, employed to extract confessions from religious and political prisoners. Burning at the stake reached its peak during the Protestant Reformation, when both Catholic and Protestant authorities utilized it to punish heretics on both sides. Additionally, hanging, drawing, and quartering remained a punishment for treason in England until the early 1800s, although its use became more limited by then. Despite our desire to relegate these horrors to a distant, unenlightened past, it's important to recognize that they were deeply ingrained in European society for centuries. Only gradually, with the spread of Enlightenment ideals of reason, justice, and human rights in the 1700s and 1800s, did these grim rituals of death and suffering begin to fade into history. Today, we reflect on the savagery of the past with a mix of fascination and solemn reverence for those who endured unimaginable suffering. We express gratitude for the relative peace, prosperity, and rule of law that prevail in much of the modern world, while acknowledging that cruelty and injustice still persist in many parts of the world. However, perhaps by confronting and remembering the darkest deeds of history, we can renew our commitment to building a world characterized by greater compassion, dignity, and mercy for all. In a world devoid of fear, where justice is tempered with wisdom and even the most humble are treated with respect, the weight of these profound themes finds solace in the progress we've made and the countless souls who have tirelessly worked to shape history towards a brighter future. While the past may be marred by blood and tears, the future lies within our grasp, waiting to be transformed into something truly remarkable. As night descends upon a medieval village, the only illumination comes from flickering torches casting eerie shadows on the grim stone walls of the local lord's castle. Within these walls, the unfortunate souls imprisoned endure an unending night, their only respite the dread of the morning's potential torments. In these brutal times, the penalties for crimes, regardless of their severity, are often unimaginable and horrific. Among the most common punishments for thieves, adulterers, and other petty criminals is a stint in the stocks or pillory. Imagine a hapless peasant, perhaps a young man who stole a loaf of bread to feed his starving family. Dragged into the village square, he is shackled to a wooden frame, his head and hands protruding through holes, unable to move or conceal his face. For hours or even days, he is subjected to the jeers and taunts of the locals, who pelt him with rotten fruit and vegetables until he is covered in putrid filth. The stench attracts flies that buzz incessantly around his head, while his muscles cramp in agonizing pain, unable to shift his position. This slow and humiliating torture is a testament to the cruelty of the past. For more serious offenses, the punishments escalate to unimaginable levels. Thieves may be subjected to branding, their flesh searing with a red-hot iron bearing the letter T as a permanent mark of their crimes. The acrid scent of burning skin fills the air, and the screams of agony echo as the iron is pressed into their cheeks or foreheads, leaving behind a ravaged, blistered wheal. The pain was excruciating, but the shame was in some ways even worse. From that day forward, the marked criminal was shunned by everyone, unable to find work or shelter, forever an outcast. One such branded thief was a woman named Alice Reeves in 14th-century London. Desperate to provide for her 3 young children after her husband's death, Alice Pilford stole a silver candlestick from a merchant's home where she worked as a maid. She was caught trying to pawn the item. At her trial, the court decreed that since this was her first offense, she would be spared execution. Instead, she would be branded on the cheek and released. As the iron was heated in the courtroom fireplace, Alice trembled and wept, begging for mercy. But her pleas fell on deaf ears. The bailiff seized her head and pressed the searing metal against her face as she screamed. The stench of burnt flesh filled the chamber. When the iron was removed, it took some of her skin with it, leaving the T burned into her cheekbone. Alice was cast out onto the street, crying in pain and despair. Her life was forever ruined by one desperate mistake. But even branding pales in comparison to the orals inflicted on prisoners in torture chambers. Many medieval castles had these dank, windowless cells where the work of extracting confessions took place away from prying eyes. The dungeons reeked of mold, human waste, and fear. In the flickering torchlight, an array of gruesome devices hung on the walls: tongs, pincers, irons. When the castle's lord or inquisitor wished to interrogate a prisoner, they would have the accused brought to the chamber in shackles. A common torture was the rack, a wooden frame fitted with ropes and cranks. The prisoner would be tied down, arms and legs outstretched. Then the torturer would turn the cranks, tightening the ropes and slowly stretching the limbs. Joints would strain against their sockets, ligaments would start to tear, and bones would crack. The agony was unbearable. Many prisoners would confess to anything, true or not, just to make the pain stop. Imagine a man accused of plotting against his king, dragged screaming to the rack in the dead of night. Despite his innocence, he proclaims it as his arms are wrenched above his head and his ankles bound. The splintery wood digs into his back as the ropes tighten, and he prays aloud, promising God that he will be good and never sin again, if only the torment would end. The crank turns, and his shoulders start to pop from their sockets, his prayers dissolving into agonized wailing. The torturer demands another confession, and initially, the prisoner refuses. However, as the pressure builds and his muscles begin to tear, he breaks. In a hoarse, ragged scream, he admits to treason, black magic, devil worship, anything his accuser suggests. All lies, but they buy him a quicker death than the slow ruin of the rack. Torture was not limited to stretching. Thumbscrews were a common and excruciating method of extracting information. These crude metal vices were tightened around the fingers or toes, slowly crushing them to pulp as the prisoner shrieked in agony. The pain was so intense that many victims would pass out. They would be revived with buckets of freezing water, only to have the screws tightened further until the bones splintered. The ruined digits would often have to be amputated later, leaving the survivor maimed. Another brutal technique was the strappado, a kind of reverse hanging. The accused would have their hands bound behind their back and then be hoisted into the air by a rope tied to their wrists. The weight of their body would wrench their arms backward and upward, dislocating the shoulders with a sickening pop. Prisoners would be dropped and raised repeatedly, each time tearing the joints further out of their sockets until they confessed or lost consciousness. Some accounts describe weights being tied to the victim's feet to increase the strain on the arms. It was an absolutely excruciating ordeal. One of the most well-documented cases of strappado torture occurred during the early 1300s with the Templar Knights. This powerful Catholic military order was accused of heresy and witchcraft by King Philip IV of France, who coveted their wealth. Consequently, dozens of Templars, including the elderly Grand Master Jacques de Molay, were arrested and subjected to brutal torture by royal inquisitors. Many of the knights were repeatedly subjected to the strappado, their shoulders being wrenched out of place until they signed false confessions. Some were even held over flames to intensify their agony. Under such duress, it's no wonder these battle-hardened warriors broke and admitted to all manner of blasphemy and depravity. Ultimately, de Molay and many of his men were burned at the stake based on confessions extracted through torture, marking a grim end to a once noble order. While torture was undoubtedly horrific, its victims usually survived, albeit maimed and traumatized. However, those condemned to execution faced an even more dreadful fate. One of the milder execution methods was beheading, which was considered a quick and merciful death, often reserved for nobles and royalty. In reality, beheading was still a gory and agonizing ordeal. Contrary to popular belief, the severed head did not die instantly. Experts believe it may retain consciousness for up to 10 seconds, based on studies of other guillotined animals. Most medieval beheadings were performed with an axe or sword, not a single-stroke guillotine, making the process even more prolonged and painful. It could take multiple blows to fully decapitate the condemned, especially if the executioner was inexperienced, hesitant, or simply inept. One of the most famously botched beheadings occurred in 1587 with Mary, Queen of Scots. After a lifetime of controversy, conspiracy, and imprisonment, Mary was condemned to death for plotting to assassinate her cousin, Queen Elizabeth of England. On the fateful morning, Mary mounted the scaffold draped in black, clutching a prayer book. After a final prayer, she gracefully knelt and placed her head on the block, her grey hair tucked into a kiff. The axeman took his position and raised his blade. However, his first blow missed Mary's slender neck and struck the back of her head, shattering her skull. She let out a groan, her body twitching. It took 2 more hacking blows to finally sever her head. The blood spurted in vivid crimson jets over the wooden platform. As the executioner lifted the detached head by the hair to show the crowd, he famously proclaimed, "God save the Queen," in reference to Elizabeth. But to his horror, he was left grasping only Mary's wig. Her head tumbled to the ground and rolled, coming to rest face up, the lips still moving in silent prayer. It was a gruesome end for the once lovely Scottish queen. Hanging was an even more common form of capital punishment, especially for commoners. The traditional short drop method did not break the neck. Instead, it strangled the condemned to death slowly, often taking many agonizing minutes of kicking and writhing at the rope's end. Witnesses described the faces of the hanged turning mottled shades of purple and black, their eyes bulging hideously and their tongues protruding. Some would foam at the mouth, their bowels and bladders loosening to soil their clothes. It was a horrible and ignominious way to die. Public hangings were a popular spectacle, drawing huge crowds. Imagine the scene: a warm summer morning, the sun glinting off the dew-dampened grass. The gallows stands stark against a clear blue sky, the ever-present ravens squawking and circling. A hush falls over the gathered throng as the condemned is led out, hands bound. A rough hemp noose is draped around their neck. A local official drones out the charges: murder, rape, treason. The hangman pulls a rough cloth hood over the accused's face. There's a tense pause, then with a snap of the lever, the trap door opens. The hooded figure plummets, pulled up short with a sickening crack as the rope goes taut. Their legs jerk and twitch spasmodically, the only sound being the creaking of the beam and the flap of bird wings. Slowly, the kicking weakens and eventually stops. The body hangs limp, swaying gently in the morning breeze, serving as a gruesome warning to all who would transgress the law. While beheading and hanging were relatively quick, some capital punishments were specifically designed to prolong the agony. For instance, pressing involved placing increasingly heavy stones on the condemned's chest until they either confessed or were crushed to death. The stones were added gradually, the weight growing from uncomfortable to painful to unbearable. It could take hours or even days for the accused to succumb, their ribs slowly cracking and their breath squeezed from their body ounce by torturous ounce. It was a truly hellish way to die. One of the most famous victims of pressing was Margaret Clio in 1586. Margaret, a devout Catholic convert during a time when Catholicism was outlawed in England, harbored fugitive priests in her home and held secret masses. Eventually, she was arrested and sentenced to pressing for refusing to enter a plea to the charges, believing the government had no right to try her for her faith. On the day of her execution, Margaret was stripped naked and spread-eagled on the ground with a sharp rock beneath her spine. Her wrists and ankles bound to stakes. A rough wooden door was placed on her chest and piled with stones. As the weight increased, she gasped out prayers, her ribs cracking audibly. For 15 agonizing minutes, more and more rocks were heaped on, witnesses marveling at her stoic endurance. With a final tortured gasp, Margaret's sternum shattered and her heart was crushed. In later years, she would be celebrated as a Catholic martyr who died for her beliefs. But in the moment, she was just another broken body sacrificed to the brutality of the age. Even more horrendous punishments awaited those convicted of heresy, witchcraft, or treason. Burning at the stake was a common punishment for crimes against God. The condemned would be tied to a tall wooden post in the town square, surrounded by bundles of firewood. As crowds gathered, eagerly anticipating the execution, the kindling was set ablaze. The flames rose slowly, intensifying in heat with each passing second. Smoke stung the eyes and choked the breath of the accused. Their clothes caught fire, shriveling away to reveal blistering, blackening skin. Fat melted and sizzled, and eventually the flames reached the face. The hair ignited in a brief corona before the flesh began to char and peel away. The screams were said to be unimaginable, high-pitched and almost inhuman. Gradually they weakened to feeble moans, then silence as the vocal cords were seared away and the lungs succumbed to the searing heat. In the end, nothing remained but a twisted, smoldering corpse slumped against the stake, breathing in greasy smoke. Perhaps the most famous victim of burning was Joan of Arc, a teenage French peasant girl turned visionary military leader. Guided by the voices of saints, Joan led the French army to unexpected victories against the English. However, her success earned her powerful enemies. Captured and tried for heresy and witchcraft, the 19-year-old was condemned to the flames. On the morning of her execution, Joan wore a long white robe and had her head shaved. She wept as she was tied to the towering stake, pleading for a cross to gaze upon in her final moments. A sympathetic priest fashioned a small crucifix from 2 twigs and held it up to her as the pyre was lit. Joan fixed her eyes on it as the flames rose around her, calling out, "Jesus, Jesus!" Her cries turned to agonized shrieks as the fire engulfed her slender body. Within minutes she fell silent, succumbing to the smoke and searing heat. As the flames died down, the charred corpse crumbled to ash. In a cruel twist of fate, Joan's remains were cast into the river to prevent their collection as holy relics. This tragic end came for a young woman who had achieved remarkable success. Perhaps even more gruesome than burning was the punishment of the breaking wheel. This severe sentence was reserved for the most heinous crimes, including banditry, murder, and treason. The condemned would be lashed spread eagle to a large wooden wagon wheel, their limbs stretched out along the spokes. The executioner would then use an iron bar to methodically shatter the bones in each arm and leg with heavy hammer-like blows. The dull, splintering cracks of breaking bone mingled with the victim's agonized screams and the jeers of the crowd. Once each limb had been crushed to a pulpy mess, the executioner would thread the mangled arms and legs through the spokes of the wheel. The wheel would then be hoisted up on a tall pole and left to spin slowly in the wind. The broken, bleeding body splattered across it served as a grim warning. Death on the wheel was a slow and excruciating process, with the victim lingering for hours or even days before succumbing to blood loss or shock. Sometimes crows or other scavengers would arrive to peck at the helpless condemned as they groaned and writhed weakly. This brutal spectacle was both effective at deterring crime and a grim reminder of the consequences of committing heinous acts. One of the most infamous breakings occurred in 1757 when Robert François Damien attempted to assassinate King Louis XV of France. Damien stabbed the king with a penknife, causing a minor wound. This crime of staggering audacity demanded a horrific retribution, and Damien was condemned to be broken alive, then dismembered by horses, his body burned, and the ashes scattered to the wind. The execution was a public spectacle attended by thousands. Damien was fastened to a scaffold with iron shackles as the executioner heated pincers in a brazier. These red-hot tongs were used to methodically tear the skin and flesh from his arms, legs, and chest. The searing metal quickly cauterized the wounds, prolonging Damien's suffering. Molten lead and boiling oil were poured into the gaping holes as he screamed in unimaginable agony. Next came the breaking. Each limb was rigidly bound to a sturdy wooden plank. With meticulous care, the executioner shattered the bones with an iron bar, turning the limbs to jelly with precise pulverizing blows. The broken, twisted arms and legs were then threaded through a wheel and hoisted up for all to witness. A gruesome sight, a red ruin of flesh, sinew, and splintered bone. Incredibly, Damien remained conscious and lucid, pleading to God for mercy. Finally, in an attempt at crucifixion, 4 horses were harnessed to each mutilated limb. They were whipped to pull in opposite directions, tearing Damien's underbelly in one swift, brutal motion. However, his tendons had been so severely damaged by the tongs and the wheel that his limbs refused to separate. The horses strained repeatedly against his lifeless weight as he wailed in boundless torment. It took numerous attempts and multiple axe blows to finally sever each arm and leg. The detached, shredded stumps were tossed into a fire along with Damien's blood-drained torso. The stench of burning meat filled the Parisian square as the assassin's remains were reduced to oily black ash. The execution had lasted an unimaginable 3 hours. It was a slow, torturous death of unthinkable sadism, a level of cruelty that modern minds find difficult to comprehend. But to the frenzied crowd, it was a just retribution. Branding wasn't only used to mark thieves and adulterers. It was also a punishment inflicted on other offenders, such as runaway slaves, deserting soldiers, religious dissenters, and seditious rebels challenging the crown. The mark served as a visible, permanent warning to society about the consequences of transgression. Imagine a young woman named Alice, a peasant from a small English village in the year 1405. She had the unfortunate misfortune of becoming pregnant out of wedlock, a moral transgression in the eyes of the church. As a consequence of her transgression, the local authorities sentenced her to be branded on her face with the letter S for her unchaste behavior. Imagine Alice being dragged to the town square, her arms bound tightly behind her back. The villagers gather around, witnessing her humiliation, their expressions a mix of pity, disgust, and morbid curiosity. A stern-faced clergyman reads out her crime and sentence, his voice filled with condemnation. Alice sobs and pleads for mercy, but her pleas are ignored. The blacksmith approaches, clutching a glowing hot iron poker from his forge. The metal tip is shaped into a menacing letter S. He positions it just inches from Alice's tear-streaked cheek as she writhes against the rough hands restraining her. With a swift and forceful motion, the blacksmith presses the searing brand into her delicate skin. Alice lets out an ungodly shriek of agony as smoke rises from her branded flesh. The stench of burning skin mingles with the palpable terror and revulsion of the crowd. After several excruciating seconds, the poker is removed, leaving behind a raw, blistered S. It's a mark of damnation that will forever mar not only Alice's face, but her entire existence in this judgmental world. As the years pass, Alice's brand heals into a raised, discolored scar. It's an inescapable reminder of her youthful indiscretion, one that affects every aspect of her hardscrabble life. Mothers pull their children closer as she passes in the street, warning them not to end up like Scarlet Alice. She is shunned by most people in the village. No respectable man will marry her, and even employers hesitate to hire her. Alice covers the shameful mark with her hair and tries to hold her head high. But always, whether alone or in a crowd, she feels the brand searing into her very soul. In a society obsessed with sin and moral purity, a branded woman like Alice was as good as dead. Dead to love, dead to hope, dead to any semblance of a normal life. Such was the power of the brand to punish and ostracize, to condemn a transgressor to a lifetime on the fringes. Naturally, individuals of higher status had means to escape the brand stigma. A noblewoman who engaged in fornication might be sent to a convent instead of facing public branding. A wealthy merchant could potentially bribe his way out of the sentence or have it commuted to a fine. However, for commoners like Alice, the brand was a lifelong burden. It served as a relentless reminder of her failure to meet society's stringent demands. Branding as a form of punishment has a long history, reaching its cruel peak in medieval Europe. Over the centuries, millions of people were disfigured and socially exiled by this brutal practice. Some may view Alice as an immoral woman who deserved her punishment. But her tragic story reveals the incredible cruelty of a world where even the most humble citizen could be forever condemned to the wrath of the church and state. With that sobering thought, let us leave poor Alice to her unending torment and continue our journey into the darkest corners of medieval justice. We descend now into the dank depths of the torture chamber, a hell of human creation where the cries of the damned resound ceaselessly. Steel your nerves and brace yourself, dear listener, for the worst is yet to come. The medieval dungeon was a shadowy labyrinth of suffering, a stone-clad womb of misery where the forsaken were swallowed up to confront their nightmares made real. These subterranean chambers were often carved directly into the bedrock beneath a castle's keep. As cold and unyielding as the hearts of the monsters who constructed them, imagine a damp, frigid cell hewn from coarse limestone. The only light that filters in through a small barred window high up the wall is weak and sickly, offering little respite from the oppressive gloom. The air is thick with the stench of decay, despair, and human suffering. Chains and manacles hang from the walls, still greasy from the flesh and fluids of previous occupants. Dried blood speckles the floor, mingling with the scattered rat droppings and the mouldering straw. Into this foul and desolate chamber, the accused were thrown, awaiting their interrogation and torment at the hands of professional torturers. These grotesque men were artists of agony, masters of extracting confessions through the infliction of hideous bodily anguish. Their grim arsenal consisted of infernal devices like the rack, the strappado, and the Iron Maiden. These machines were designed solely for one sinister purpose: to break the body and shatter the spirit. The rack, one of the most widely used instruments, was a large rectangular wooden frame with rollers at both ends. The victim, naked and spread-eagled, was bound by the wrists and ankles to the cordage. As the interrogator posed his questions, the rollers were turned by handles, steadily increasing the tension on the ropes. Imagine a burly jailer cranking the creaking wooden cogs, tightening the ropes, and stretching the helpless prisoner's body to its utmost limits. Limbs elongate agonizingly, muscles and tendons scream in protest, joints crack and strain against their sockets, and the hapless captive howls in pain, feeling his very bones slowly separating. Yet the implacable inquisitor continues, determined to extract a confession, true or false, through this excruciating method. There are numerous documented cases of people being literally torn apart on the rack, their limbs rent from limb until their tortured senses could bear no more and gave way with a sickening wet snap. One can only imagine the ungodly shrieks and groans, the percussive pops of dislocation, and the warm blood spattering as skin and muscle stretch beyond their capacities and rip like overworked linen. Of course, the skilled torturer aimed to prolong the torment for as long as possible, bringing his subject to the very edge of annihilation before backing off, allowing the extorted admission or accusation to spill forth from cracked, parched lips. The rack's power to elicit confessions was undeniable, and that was its true evil, surpassing even the grievous physical wounds it inflicted. People would say anything, fabricate any story, condemn any innocent, to escape the rack's torment. Consider Nicholas Braun, an English papist implicated in a plot against King James I in 1604. Crown agents arrested Braun and subjected him to the rack, stretching him mercilessly for hours. Delirious with pain, the young priest concocted wild tales about a conspiracy between the Pope and the Spanish to invade England and assassinate the monarch. None of it was true, but the tormented Braun would have gladly denounced his own mother if it would alleviate his suffering on the rack. Such was the insanity-inducing power of this vile apparatus. The rack left its mangled victims permanently scarred, both physically and mentally. Assuming they survived the ordeal, they often lost the use of tortured limbs, developed chronic pain in overextended joints, and were haunted by searing dread and the nightmare sounds of their own anguished screams. And always in the lurid theatre of their memories, there would remain the leering faces of their tormentors, their hands on the rollers, persistently asking as they strained and contorted on the very brink of human endurance. So vivid was this torture, so indelible its cruel mark on the psyche, that some prisoners continued to have startling confessions spill unbidden from their lips, long after their stint on the rack was over. A few were so shattered that they went to the gallows reciting the fictitious crimes squeezed out of them. The false witnesses beaten out of their broken flesh by the pitiless machinery of the medieval Inquisition. With a rueful sigh, we turn now from the rack and its wretched recipients. But do not unclench yet, gentle listener, for our macabre tour of dungeon depravities has only begun. More monstrous devices await in the gloom, each more fishy conceived than the last. We descend into a pit of institutionalized torment, spiraling into a Stygian abyss where no glimmer of benevolence or mercy can penetrate. After the Catholic woman Margaret Cleo was slowly pressed to death over 15 agonizing minutes for harboring priests, her broken body was displayed publicly. Her fate served as a chilling warning to those who dared defy the laws against Catholicism. Despite this, many continued to risk the same terrible punishment to secretly practice their forbidden faith. Such religious persecution was rampant in medieval Europe. Charges of heresy could lead to the most dreadful deaths, often by burning at the stake. One of history's most renowned victims of this cruel sentence was the French peasant girl turned military leader, Joan of Arc. Joan's early life offered little indication of her extraordinary destiny. Born to humble farmers around the year 1412, she had a typical peasant childhood. However, as a deeply pious young girl, Joan began experiencing vivid religious visions that she believed were messages from God. Divine voices guided her to take up arms and help crown a French king to drive out the occupying English forces. Displaying remarkable charisma and conviction, the teenage Joan gained an audience with the French royal court. She won the tentative support of Crown Prince Charles, who desperately needed a morale boost for his beleaguered troops. Outfitted in men's armor and wielding a white banner, Joan led the French to several improbable victories against the English, bringing hope to her war-weary people. but Joan's brilliant military career was short-lived. In 130, she was captured by enemy soldiers loyal to England and put on trial for heresy and witchcraft. In a sham inquisition, hostile clerics attempted to trap the illiterate farm girl with theological wordplay. Joan's claims of divine guidance were used to condemn her as a blasphemous heretic. Found guilty, the 19-year-old was sentenced to burn at the stake. On the morning of her execution, Joan was tied to a tall pillar in the town square of Rouen, with bundles of wood stacked beneath her feet. As crowds gathered, the pyre was set ablaze. Witnesses described the thick smoke and intense heat of the rising flames engulfing the frail figure clad in white. Joan's anguished cries echoed over the crackling blaze until her once vibrant voice finally succumbed to silence. The English executioners retrieved the coals, revealing the charred and smoking corpse. However, it was said that Joan's heart remained untouched by the flames. Her ashes were callously scattered into the River Seine. In a cruel twist of fate, Joan was later exonerated from all charges and declared a martyr by the Pope. Today, the illiterate peasant girl is revered as a saint, while her English persecutors are remembered as the true villains for their unwavering faith. Joan endured an excruciating death. Her short life was extinguished in one of the most horrific execution methods ever devised. Burning was considered an appropriate punishment for heretics, as the purifying power of flames was believed to destroy evil and cleanse the soul. However, other gruesome forms of execution were also employed to serve as a lasting example to the condemned. The gruesome spectacle of the breaking wheel was almost unparalleled in its slow cruelty. Typically reserved for the most despised criminals, the breaking wheel began with the victim firmly tied to a large cartwheel, their limbs splattered between the spokes. With a heavy iron cudgel or the blunt edge of an axe, the executioner methodically smashed the knees, elbows, shoulders, and hips, shattering each joint with hammer-like blows. Some variations commenced with the legs and progressed upwards, prolonging the agony. Shattered bones tore through flesh as the wheels slowly revolved, transforming the criminal into a mangled wreck. The gruesome remains were then woven through the wheel spokes and hoisted on a tall pole, left to succumb to shock and exposure over hours or days. Crows pecking at the flesh of the broken bodies served as a grim reminder of the consequences of defying the law. Among the most notorious victims of the breaking wheel was Peter Stump, better known as the Werewolf of Badberg. In 16th-century Germany, Stump terrorized the countryside. Accused of murder, robbery, black magic, rape, cannibalism, and shapeshifting into a ravenous wolf-like beast, his more fantastical charges seemed like superstitious fears of the peasants. However, his reputation as a violent bandit was well established. After his capture in 1589, Stump confessed under torture to killing 13 children and 2 pregnant women, tearing the fetuses from their wombs to devour. He showed no remorse for his heinous crimes. Condemned as a formidable threat to society, Stump faced a uniquely brutal combination of punishments. On the day of his public execution, the Werewolf of Badberg was first lashed to a wooden wheel. The executioner took his time, pulverizing each of Stump's limbs, drawing out his blood-curdling howls. As the wheel slowly rotated, the bandit's shattered arms and legs flopped about, causing both horror and fascination among the crowd. But Stump's ordeal was far from over. Next, his mangled body was unbound and fastened to a sturdy table. In full view of the captivated mob, Stump had his flesh ripped from his broken bones with sharp pincers in 10 agonizing places. Finally, the mutilated highwayman was beheaded. As a final insult, Stump's corpse was burned to ashes, denying him a Christian burial. His torture and execution were remembered for generations as a stark reminder of the savagery of the law and the even greater savagery of those who defied it. Such extreme public punishments were considered a necessary deterrent to maintain order in a harsh, lawless time. Another exceptionally cruel method of execution, designed to captivate an audience, was boiling alive. The gruesome spectacle of a human being slowly being cooked to death was sure to leave an indelible mark on even the most hardened medieval minds. The practice of boiling criminals alive had its origins in ancient Babylonia and was employed throughout the medieval period for various heinous crimes, including coin counterfeiting, poisoning, and murder. A large kettle or cauldron was filled with water, oil, tar, or even molten lead, and placed over a roaring fire. The cauldron was often displayed publicly in advance, allowing onlookers to witness the rising steam and bubbling surface, which hinted at the unimaginable agony that awaited the condemned. When the liquid reached a searing temperature, the condemned would be lowered into the cauldron with ropes or chains, thrashing and shrieking as their skin reeled and blistered upon contact. Alternatively, the victim could be suspended above the stinking vat and gradually immersed, intensifying the pain with each passing minute. As the minutes ticked by, flesh peeled away from bones in gruesome strips, eyeballs burst, and internal organs cooked within the body. Despite their desperate pleas for mercy and futile struggles to escape, the outcome was always the same, a gruesome and agonizing demise. After what seemed like an eternity, the lifeless, stewed corpse of the criminal would be fished out with hooks and unceremoniously dumped for disposal. One of England's most notorious cases of boiling occurred in 1531. Richard Rose, a cook in the household of the powerful Bishop of Rochester, was arrested for attempting to poison the clergy and his guests. Rose had allegedly stirred a lethal toxin into a pot of porridge, resulting in the deaths of 2 individuals and the severe illness of many others. While Rose claimed it was an accident, he was convicted of treason for his suspected assassination attempt and sentenced to be boiled alive. To serve as a grim warning, King Henry VIII enacted a special Act of Parliament declaring that all prisoners condemned for poison would henceforth share the gruesome fate of the cook. On the day of the execution, Rose was paraded through the streets of London, met with both cheers and jeers from the crowd. At the gruesome scene, he was bound and suspended with ropes over a bubbling cauldron. As he was slowly lowered in, inch by agonizing inch, Rose's tormented cries filled the air. Londoners watched in morbid glee as the poisoner was boiled to death before their eyes, a display of royal authority. Rose's ghastly execution stood as a centuries-long warning against defying the crown and the heinous crime of poisoning. Perhaps the only medieval punishment more notorious than boiling alive was the dreadful practice of hanging, drawing, and quartering, reserved for the most despised enemies of the state. This gruesome combination of execution methods was designed to inflict the utmost suffering and humiliation. The ritual of hanging, drawing, and quartering typically commenced with the condemned being tied to a wooden hurdle or fence panel and dragged through the streets by a horse. The jostling, scraping journey to the scaffold was both degrading and agonizing, leaving the prisoner bruised and bloodied before the execution even began. Upon reaching the public square, a jeering crowd gathered to witness the spectacle. The first step was hanging, but only partially. The condemned would be dropped from a platform with a rope around their neck, but cut down and revived before they could choke to death. Then came the drawing, a euphemism for disemboweling. The executioner would take a sharp knife and slice open the prisoner's abdomen, pulling out yards of slippery intestines and organs and tossing them into a waiting bucket or fire. Fortunately, this was often fatal, but not always. If the condemned was still alive, they faced the final horror of quartering. Their body would be hacked into 4 pieces with an axe. The severed head was often placed on a spike, and the quarters sent to the far corners of the kingdom as a terrifying display of the king's power. Sometimes the head was even dipped in tar to preserve it as a long-lasting warning. The quartered pieces of the condemned might be left for the crows, tossed into a fire, or buried in unconsecrated ground, denying them the eternal rest of a proper Christian burial. The grim litany of criminals subjected to hanging, drawing, and quartering reads like a who's who of medieval English villains. In 1305, Scottish rebel leader William Wallace was executed for treason after rising up against King Edward I. The fierce warrior endured the full punishment, hanging by the neck, being cut down while still alive, disemboweled, beheaded, and quartered. In 1606, Guy Fawkes met the same terrible fate for his involvement in the failed gunpowder plot to assassinate King James I and restore a Catholic monarch. Fawkes was sentenced to the usual traitor's death, but cleverly escaped execution by jumping from the scaffold and breaking his own neck. His co-conspirators, however, were not so fortunate and endured the gruesome full quartering as crowds roared in bloodthirsty approval. The last victim to be hanged, drawn, and quartered in England was the French spy François-Henri de Lamotte, executed in 1781 for treason. His screams haunted witnesses for years after. While the punishment was later officially abolished as a relic of a more brutal era, its gory legacy remains etched in history and popular imagination, serving as a grim reminder of the cruel extremes of the medieval justice system. The brutal and barbaric punishments of the Middle Ages, by today's standards, can be attributed to several factors. Firstly, people lived short, harsh, and dangerous lives, intimately familiar with death and suffering. Consequently, executions were public entertainment, serving as a salutary spectacle. There was little sympathy for the cruel fates of criminals and outcasts. Ironically, over-the-top punishments may have even encouraged worse behavior in the long run. If all crimes were punished severely, there was little incentive for restraint, creating a vicious cycle of cruelty that begets more cruelty. Fortunately, our modern justice systems have come a long way from the torture chambers and gallows of the past. The medieval thirst for vengeance and retribution has largely given way to principles of fairness, rehabilitation, and humane treatment of prisoners. Most countries have abolished the death penalty entirely. We can look back on the monstrous punishments of the Middle Ages as a grim but fascinating relic of our distant past, a part of our history that we are grateful to leave behind as the last warble of the songbirds outside heralds the coming of dawn. We can drift off to sleep, our dreams untainted by the nightmarish spectre of medieval cruelty and injustice. As the wretched criminal was led to the gallows, a hush fell over the gathered crowd. They had witnessed hangings before, but each one still carried a weight of grim finality. The condemned man, a thief and a brigand, received little sympathy from the onlookers. They saw his execution as a necessary cleansing, a removal of a rotten element from their society. The executioner, a hooded figure clad in black, stood impassively as the prisoner was brought before him. With practiced motions, he secured the noose around the man's neck. The rough hemp scratched against his skin. The thief's eyes darted wildly, searching for some last-minute reprieve, but none was forthcoming. At a nod from the local magistrate, the executioner pulled the lever. The trapdoor beneath the condemned man's feet swung open with a clatter, and he plunged downward. The rope snapped, and a sickening crack echoed across the square as his neck broke. His body twitched and danced, feet kicking at empty air, before finally going limp. Justice in the eyes of medieval society had been served. However, not all those who met the hangman's noose had their necks broken. In many cases, death by hanging was a slow and agonizing ordeal. The condemned would dangle, choking and gasping, as the rope gradually cut off their air supply. This strangulation could take several long, excruciating minutes. During the Middle Ages, many people from common criminals to political dissidents faced a grim fate. The gallows stood as a constant reminder of the consequences of breaking the law in medieval towns and villages. However, even hanging, though brutal and efficient, was not the most severe punishment. For those who committed particularly heinous acts or who caught the attention of powerful individuals, even more gruesome punishments awaited. One such punishment was pressing. The condemned would be laid on the ground, and heavy stones or iron weights would be gradually piled upon their chest. The weight would slowly crush the victim, making each breath increasingly difficult until suffocation ensued. This was the fate of Margaret Clio, a woman living in 16th-century England. Her crime was harboring Catholic priests, an act that had been outlawed as the country underwent the tumultuous religious changes of the Protestant Reformation. For her defiance, Margaret was sentenced to pressing. Despite the ordeal, she endured it with remarkable courage, refusing to plead and thereby denying the authorities a formal trial. As the weights pressed down upon her, she is said to have whispered prayers until her last breath. Her martyrdom became a symbol of faith and resistance for England's persecuted Catholics. While pressing was undoubtedly a terrible way to die, it palled in comparison to the agony of being burned at the stake. This punishment was often reserved for those convicted of heresy or witchcraft, crimes that were considered offences against the very soul of medieval society. The condemned would be tied to a wooden post surrounded by bundles of firewood. As the flames were ignited, they would swiftly spread, consuming the dry tinder and licking at the victim's clothes and skin. The heat would become unbearable, and the smoke would thicken and choke. Those burned at the stake endured an excruciating death. their screams reverberating over the crackling flames. It was a slow and dreadful method of execution, often accompanied by crowds of onlookers who witnessed the gruesome spectacle. One of the most renowned victims of burning was Joan of Arc, a young French peasant girl who claimed divine visions and led her country's armies against the English. Despite her military successes, Joan was eventually captured and subjected to a trial for heresy. The trial was a farce, more concerned with political maneuvering than justice. Joan's refusal to submit to church authority sealed her fate. She was sentenced to burn. As the flames engulfed her, she clutched a crucifix and cried out the name of Jesus. Her ashes were scattered in the sand to prevent her followers from collecting relics. Joan's story serves as a poignant reminder of the capricious and often cynical nature of medieval justice. Those in power wielded accusations of crimes like heresy as tools to eliminate threats and consolidate their own positions. The horrific punishments they inflicted were not merely about delivering justice, but also about sending a message and maintaining control. Perhaps the most infamous of all medieval execution methods was the gruesome practice of hanging, drawing, and quartering. This was the ultimate punishment for high treason, a crime against the very foundations of social order. The condemned traitor would be dragged behind a horse to the execution site, a symbolic act symbolizing their loss of status and dignity. They would then be hanged until nearly dead, their limp body cut down before the life force had fully departed. What followed was truly horrific. The executioner would cut open the traitor's abdomen, spilling their entrails onto the ground. The condemned would watch in horror as their internal organs were burned before their very eyes, clinging to the last vestiges of life. Finally, their body would be beheaded and divided into 4 pieces, the quarters of the punishment's name. William Wallace, the Scottish knight and rebel leader who defied English rule, met a gruesome fate. After leading a spirited resistance and securing several victories, Wallace was captured and brought to London for trial. Refusing to submit to English authority, he denounced the court and declared his allegiance solely to Scotland. Consequently, he was sentenced to the death penalty for treason, hanging, drawing, and quartering. Contemporary accounts vividly describe the dreadful scene of his execution. Despite the horrific stages, Wallace remained steadfast, enduring each with remarkable courage until the final blow of the axe ended his suffering. His body was dismembered, and his head was mounted on London Bridge as a warning to potential rebels. However, rather than quelling the Scottish resistance, Wallace's martyrdom only fueled further rebellion. His gruesome death became a rallying cry, symbolizing the cruelty of English oppression and the unyielding spirit of Scottish independence. As we reflect on these dark chapters of history, it's easy to feel a sense of horror and revulsion. The cruelty and brutality of medieval justice can seem almost incomprehensible to modern sensibilities. Nevertheless, it's important to remember that these practices didn't end with the Middle Ages. Many of these gruesome punishments persisted well into the early modern period, and their echoes can still be observed in certain parts of the world today. On the other hand, we can also take solace in the progress made. Over the centuries, as societies evolved and values shifted, many of the most brutal practices of medieval justice have been abolished. The rise of Enlightenment ideals, the growth of democratic institutions, and the recognition of universal human rights have all contributed to a gradual civilizing of the justice system. Today, in much of the world, the focus of justice has shifted from retribution and deterrence to rehabilitation and restoration. While the system is far from flawless and injustices still persist, we've made significant progress since the dark days of medieval dungeons and public scaffolds. As we drift off to sleep, let's be grateful for the relative peace and security we enjoy in the modern world. While it's important to remember and learn from the horrors of history, they don't have to haunt our dreams. Instead, we can rest easy, secure in the knowledge that we live in a time of greater justice, compassion, and hope for a brighter future. With that thought, dear listener, I bid you good night. May your dreams be filled with the warm light of a better tomorrow, not the dark shadows of the past. If you've enjoyed this journey through history, please like and subscribe. There are many more tales to tell, and I look forward to sharing them with you. Until next time, sleep well.